For this visual essay, I have decided to incorporate a verbal or speaking component amongst my photos. I have done this in accordance with my newfound learning that storytelling is an important aspect of Indigenous education and epistemology. This is my own story of the educational process I have experienced throughout this semester. A large component of my learning process has been the recognition of the importance of growth. As Battiste states of education, you have to have enough love of learning to have the courage to remake it, imagine it, and teach it. The personal growth I have experienced in this classroom space thus far has been immense. The stories that have been told by Indigenous voices have challenged and impacted me greatly. However, personal growth is only the foundation of this experience, and I am now very focused on how I can grasp the information presented to me and utilize it as an educator. How will I take what I have witnessed here and share it with my future students? Although I have grown personally, one of the greatest lessons I have learned from Indigenous scholars is the importance of being a lifelong learner. This is illustrated by Battiste when she states that for Indigenous peoples, learning is a lifelong process. My first photo, a closed flower that you can see here, represents my status before beginning this learning process. Of course, the main goal of each living plant is to grow strong and tall. As a pre-service educator, I have the same goal, to take the wealth of information provided to me and incorporate it to benefit my future students. However, this course has helped me to see that a singular worldview can be a detriment to this learning and sharing process. Much like a flower, in order to fully experience growth, I must recognize that my inner mind does not have all of the answers, that often I must open up my petals in order to have new experiences and to grow. My second photo represents this newfound growth, as well as my commitment to being a lifelong learner. The flower is now open, and the sun's rays will allow the flower to grow steady and tall. As long as the flower continues to accept the rays of the sun, it will grow and prosper. Similar to this flower, I strongly feel that I have become more open to knowledge that contradicts my own experience. I have learned that in order to grow as an educator, I must be open to constantly challenging my learning. I must remake and reimagine my pedagogy based on the new information that I learn throughout my life. I strongly believe this journey can begin within an Indigenous context. An instance of my growth in learning thus far relates to the residential schooling system and the act of storytelling. As Battiste states, no education system is perfect, yet few have a history as destructive to human potential as Canada's, with its obsession with assimilation. The cultural genocide that occurred in residential schools within Canada has truly shocked me and I believe will stimulate me to action. As an educator, I now recognize I must have a very thoughtful role in relation to Indigenous education. Because the history of Indigenous education for youth in Canada has been so violent and oppressive, I must take care to ensure my practices are respectful and unified. By respectful, I refer to the Our Words, Our Ways document, which will help me reflect on a number of important questions when evaluating resources used in my classroom. And by unified, I refer to the extent at which I wish to incorporate these resources, in the hopes to engage Indigenous students respectfully. This goal is outlined by Battiste. She states that it is time to change the educational outcomes for Aboriginal youth by fully integrating their knowledge and heritage into an education system that allows Aboriginal students to engage and celebrate who they are. Furthermore, I have recognized the impact and importance of storytelling. As stated by Pratt and Daniels, as Aboriginal educators, we ask that you take the time to listen deeply and remember the stories of all. They and their stories matter. The stories of Indigenous people, especially in relation to residential schools, must be told more often in the classroom. As further stated by Pratt and Daniels, the act of listening to a story is a subjective experience that delivers the message necessary for each listener at each point in time. Once we have heard a story, particularly a memorable story, we can never return to our uninformed state. I have learned that storytelling, an impactful Indigenous concept, is perhaps one of the greatest educational tools available. I fully intend to incorporate storytelling into my future classroom. I can do this by implementing more verbal work amongst my students or by inviting Indigenous scholars, elders, and survivors into my classroom to tell their stories if they wish to. Furthermore, I now believe that learning itself is, quote, a communal activity involving family, by Battiste, and I therefore strive to connect with the Indigenous communities of my students in order to gain insights on their stories, their desires, and their thoughts on my pedagogy. Little Bear states that, no matter how dominant a worldview is, there are always other ways of interpreting the world. Therefore, my third photo represents the important concept of relationships. In this photo, a barely visible grain of sand sits alone. Metaphorically, this sand represents myself, a small entity that alone cannot achieve or accomplish very much. Relating to the words of Little Bear, I have a singular worldview, and alone that worldview is only serving myself and those that may share it. In my fourth and final photo, you can see the power of connections. Together, hundreds of grains of sand along with pieces of rock, wood, shells, and water come together to make a beach. Each interacts with one another, and as the metaphor states, one grain of sand simply cannot create a beach. This metaphor is emphasized in the words of St. Denis, who states that colonization and racialization are also what tie Aboriginal people to non-Aboriginal. We have long since ceased to be islands unto ourselves. By acknowledging a common experience of colonization and racism, educators can enact solidarity and join together to challenge racism and racialization. These photos serve as a commitment to connect with and share the Indigenous voices around me. As a grain of sand, I have much to learn from the rocks, shells, water particles, and other grains of sand on the beach. By a sharing process, including witnessing, listening, and speaking, comprehending each of our experiences in colonization is one path to reconciliation. I believe that it is these connections that will help us connect and break barriers of racism, inequality, and singular worldviews relating to Indigenous peoples across Canada.